I'm going to tell you a little bit about those stories on which the Christians base their faith. They're called the Gospels, and we all know there are 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. In my innocence as a child, I imagine they were 4 of his disciples. Of course, anyone who's ever actually read the Bible would know that that's not the case. However, 2 of them allegedly are his disciples. The 2 others are companions of Paul. But we now know that this idea that they were early eyewitnesses is unsustainable. If we look at the so-called synoptic Gospels, that's the 3 that appear very similar, Matthew, Mark and Luke, we discover, in fact, that the core story originates from Mark. Mark is the first of the Gospels, even though it doesn't appear as the earliest of the Gospels. Now, Mark is reproduced in great detail and word for word in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Now, there's something very curious about that. Matthew is supposedly one of the 12 disciples and was a witness to much that had happened with Jesus. Why would it be the case that Matthew copies the testimony of Mark, who was not a witness? Are we understanding this? We have a supposed witness to the events whose own testimony is copied from a non-witness. Is there anything more ludicrous than that? And the same holds up for Luke, who, although he's not one of the 12 disciples, nonetheless his testimony cannot be regarded as any sort of eyewitness statement because he borrows from Mark, a non-witness. So we have a curious situation here that none of the testimonies are in fact eyewitness statements. Now, John, it comes into a class all of its own, and it has its own difficulties. I mean, the most telling thing and difficulty of John is that much of the reports given in the synoptic Gospels regarding John do not appear in John's own Gospel. Now, the most striking thing here is the transfiguration on the mountaintop. Jesus, we're told, in the early point of his ministry, takes his favourite disciples, James, John and Peter, to a mountaintop, and there he transfigures into some glowing apparition and has the attendance of Elijah and Moses, who put in an appearance on the mountaintop, and then to complete the gathering, God himself appears and transmits a message from a cloud. Now, this is all by way of giving evidence to 3 humans, James, John and Peter, that he is in fact no mere mortal. Now, an extraordinary event, it obviously never actually occurred, but let's suppose it did occur. How could it be the case that when the Apostle John comes to write his gospel, his story of his encounters and his time spent with Jesus, he forgets to he mentions not a single word of Jesus transfiguring on a mountaintop? I mean, hell, if that really happened, that would be not something you would forget to mention. The synoptics mention John in incidents at least 20 times in their own Gospels, and yet none of them are recorded by John himself in his own Gospel. These are just some of the problems of the Gospels, the documents on which the Christians base their faith. Despite everything you may have learnt when you were a child, the truth is that scholars, even theologians, have no certain idea who wrote the Gospels. They have no clear idea when they were written, and they have no idea where they were written.